Hello and welcome to another one of our Sonic Lab presentations. I'm here in Sonic Towers in Bath, and I'm here with Bogdan, who's there in Canada, and we're talking about the Polyend Tracker, of which I have one in hardware here. Bogdan has one over there in Canada, and he's also there in person. So Bogdan, you're an artist, recording artist, and you've been using trackers like right from year zero. So this must be kind of quite familiar territory for you, right?
Very much so, yeah. I'm trying not to think about how long it's been. Probably about pushing 30 years now that I've been using trackers. So very important in my life, I would say, yeah.
It's interesting when this came out. I mean, I will have to say that the actual hardware of this thing is a thing of real beauty. It's really nicely made, but inside it ultimately is kind of the heart and the notion of what an original tracker was. But I think there's this sort of misconception when it comes to trackers, and believe me, I am very impatient when it comes to obfuscated workflows, that they're somehow very difficult and sort of nerdy to use. But actually, I mean, I found it's quite a quick way of working, and presumably you feel much the same way, right?
I do, and I think that's one of the key things about the tracker is actually the ability to get into um, just this flow into the zone in a way that I found really quite jarring once I left trackers for a little bit. There was a little stint where I was into DAWs and things like that, and just the simple move of having to go to use a mouse really made a drastic impact in how quickly I was able to make music, and even in the kind of music I was able to make. So, yeah, it's definitely something that's quite unique. Yeah.
I mean, we should probably just cover the hardware a little bit. Essentially, this is an eight-track sequencer with each track is monophonic, but each step in that sequence can be, any number of instruments that you can load in. It's sample based. You load in samples. You can load in wavetables. You can sample into it. It's got a radio in it. I mean, there's facts and figures on the whole thing. We're not doing a review here, but one thing I wanted to sort of check out is have you got like a pattern that you can start so people can kind of get an idea of what sort of capabilities we're talking about?
Yeah, I do actually have something loaded here. It's fairly simple, but let me just give it a whirl, and I can also have it going so you can see the tracker in the pattern.
So you're playing like a song mode here, presumably, and it's each time it's changing, we're loading a new track into a new pattern into the song, right?
That's exactly right, yeah.
So there's quite a lot of stuff going on here. I think maybe if you stop that, we can have a look, because I think one thing that people perhaps don't realize what is so at the heart of a tracker is a kind of is an event, and each event can have all kinds of other parameters associated with it. So maybe take us to one of those patterns and sort of break it down a little bit for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's start it back maybe on the start there. So the simplest way to start, I guess, would be to say that there's a number of steps in each pattern. If you use a regular drum machine, it's got 16 steps, but in a tracker pattern, it starts with 32, and you can expand it. You see the length here is set to 64. You can go all the way up to 128. But if you're more comfortable with 16, you can do that too. And then once you've got the steps down, you've got 4 columns. The first one is your note column, so it's a C octave 5. I'm using the 8th sample. And then you've got 2 effects columns where you can put a number of different effects into. And really that's the foundation. You've got 8 tracks, and in the tracker you can see all of the columns at once, or you can switch to this kind of simplified view where you can see all 8 columns. at the
Ah,
same time.
I didn't figure that one out. That's something I've learned. That's the thing I found with this. There's lots of little kind of nifty workflow ways. So I mean, you don't have to do a lot of jumping around. For instance, if you want to put a bass drum on the fours and you have a 32 bar pattern, a 32 step pattern, you can have it just every time you hit go, it can put it in every 4 bars. I mean, there's lots of kind of shortcuts and ways to go, because it is very step based, but you can record real time as well, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, yeah. It really just depends on what your preference is, how you normally compose music. Some people like to, just hit record and play things live. Some people like to do one step at a time. It really just depends on, how you do things, how you like to do things. Yeah. But there's a lot of breathing room as well.
So when you're putting something together yourself, when do you start? Because it's a different sort of mental headspace that you're in when you're working with a tracker. And when I had this one here, I thought it would really not be for me. And I'm not pretending that I'm a massive step pattern fan, but I found it a lot easier to use than I expected.
To be honest with you, I usually don't start with an idea. I kind of might load some samples and just start plopping them down and just adding things on and seeing how it sounds, tweaking. You can actually, tweak the parameters, which is something that's very unique to the Polyend Tracker. You can tweak, depending on what kind of sample you've got loaded, you can change the effects. You can change the actual sample parameters, whether it's panning, different positions. You can get very in-depth, but me personally, I just like to start putting samples down, running a loop, adding onto it, seeing how it sounds, maybe changing octaves or changing notes, shuffling things around. It's really very open to kind of how you like to do things. And you might also find that the way you're used to working in a non-tracker environment, say like a DAW or something like that, is very different, and that's also something that's quite exciting, just kind of discovering that there's a new way to make tracks, and you might find that your output is actually very different.
So, I mean, the sample playback is quite basic in terms of it doesn't do time stretching or real time. It's like you sample into it, you transpose, and you could do the editing and chopping up and whatnot, and record from the inputs or record from. There's a built-in radio, I think, in there as well, so you can get things going. So there's quite an interesting way of doing things, and very very much self-contained. So, there's also effects in there, and the whole kind of sequencing and building things up. I mean, how do you find you work with lots of short samples, or are you thinking in terms of kind of larger snippets and that you're kind of like break beats and whatnot?
I actually prefer to work with shorter samples and then create my own loops. There is a lot more that you can do beyond just doing simple one-shots. Here you can see in the sample playback, if you want, you can just do a simple one shot, but there's also loops, backward loop, forward loop. There's also slicing and beat slicing, and there's wavetable and granular modes. So there's actually quite a bit of flexibility in terms of how you play back a sample. So if you're coming from an Akai or something like that, where you hit a pad and it plays a sample, that's kind of just the start of what you can do with a tracker. There's a lot more that you can accomplish.
So I'm curious, because I didn't really get into the granular and the wavetable stuff. Have you got anything running in this particular session that is using that we could have a look at?
I don't have anything loaded in the granular, but let's just take the sample here. So I've got sample 13, which is kind of a trumpet pattern. So you can change the position that it starts at, and then you can also change the length. You can also change the shape and where the loop goes. all the way up to, you know, completely getting a completely different character. And you can travel in your sample and find different starting points.
And of course, there's filtering and effects in here, which give us additional sound shaping capabilities, right?
Right. You can do delay, you can do reverb, and of course, you've also got your, you know, the two effects columns for each track that you can use as well. So for things like panning, rolls, there's really so much that you can do per track, per sample, beyond editing the actual samples themselves. Yeah.
So I noticed there were some kind of quite glitchy things going on at certain parts in those patterns. I mean, are you using kind of timing effects and whatnot? Because maybe people aren't familiar with the sort of level of step editing that you can get into with some of these. Have you got something you can maybe explode out for us there?
So yeah, it's just this random note function that you can do, and depending on the setting that you have for it, it will change the speed of it and kind of what notes it ends up finding.
So do you put those on the effects steps, so the effects columns in the step? Is that where this is being put on?
That's right, yeah. This is in effect column 1. So I've got the random note there.
But I mean, I suppose the other thing to mention is that each step, once you've assigned a effect column 1 for that step, that doesn't mean it's all the way down the rest of the pattern. The next step could have effects column 1 be something completely different, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's, you know, you could have a completely different effect for every step. So if you've got, I'm sure that wouldn't sound great, but you could, you can customize it on every step, in every pattern. So you're certainly not locked in by any means. And I think that's one of the powerful things you can do is really utilize those effects to give your tracks more depth and more character.
So, I mean, one thing that maybe people are thinking, oh, it's actually very sort of UI intensive. You know, there's not much in terms of, you know, playing it in, but actually you can play stuff in. You play stuff in on those on the pads. So you got 48 pads here, which you could play. So when you are playing, you can play kind of quite real time. Do they have velocity? I'm trying to remember if I'm getting that right.
No.
I think they don't have velocity. It's something that you would sort of dial in using again one of the effects pads, one of the effects tracks or the volume track, right?
Yeah, you can very much kind of play it live and find, you know, progressions or notes, and then when you're ready to go, you can hit record, or you can go on a per step basis and you know, put in your notes. Yeah, it's just very flexible.
One of the things also that's come up is, you know, it is possible to create entire tracks in it, because you can have the drums, you can have individual samples, you can have effects. You've got also an input that you can bring in real time, so you could actually submix other instruments into it and have that maybe clocking some external MIDI things. There's a Mixdown feature in there. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, there is, absolutely. You can you can export either to 2 stereo tracks, or you can export stems. So if you want to do some mixing afterwards, you can export the whole song or song stems. You can even do a pattern stems. Or if you're into Impulse Tracker, there's even an export as Impulse Tracker function for those tracker heads that remember that one. And you can even export kind of a pattern that you've got, or a section of a pattern, to kind of bounce things down. If if it'll be a sample.
Okay, one thing about this, I mean, even though it's sample based, there's an SD card that comes with, I think, 16 gigs. There's a whole ton of content in there. ARC Noise, Jamie Liddell's done some stuff. Plug Hugger, there's a whole bunch of things. I mean, is there room for expansion there? I mean, what's going on with that? Would we like to see more packs coming up?
I think so. And I think there will be some exclusive artist editions that Polyend is working on, but I'm a little bit tight-lipped on that. They're releasing more info in April.
Right. Okay. We
So
look forward to that.
keep an eye out for that. Yeah.
Right, but I mean, just talking about the sample stuff, I think it's like 133 seconds maximum. It is mono sampling, isn't it? So it's kind of quite basic in that sense. But as long as you're working within those parameters, you can bring those kind of things in. But I guess you could bounce multiple samples down and bring them back in again to save space, I guess. So it's quite old school in terms of technical limitations. I mean, some people, it's interesting with technical limitations because often people sort of say, oh, in this day and age, it should do X, Y, and Z. But actually, many of us also bang on about the fact that having technical limitations is actually quite creatively liberating because you know what you're working with. Is that something that you find attractive about the whole tracker system and the way it works?
I do think so. Yeah, absolutely. I think any kind of system has a limitation. And in fact, the lack of a limitation can be quite intimidating itself. You know, like when you open up a DAW, your eye is searching for, okay, where do I go next, right? There's a whole number of things that you can do, and unless you're really focused, it's hard to know what to do. With a tracker like Polyend Tracker, it's a lot more simplified, and the interface is simplified. You've got 8 tracks, you've got, you know, whatever samples that you're using, and it just forces you to really kind of focus on exactly, it forces you to kind of be really focused, or if you're not focused, there's not as much that you can do with a DAW, which I hesitate to say, I guess, because it maybe makes it sound too limited, but I think there's a sweet spot with having creative freedom, and and I think this definitely hits that.
One thing I couldn't find, because it works, I mean, we're talking in 16s and 8s and 32s at the moment, but actually you can do odd numbers of steps, so you can do whatever time signature you feel like. There's no real kind of, that's on a per pattern basis. I couldn't figure out how you do swing, though. Is there a kind of, it all seemed to be a little bit kind of, that was a little bit too granular for me.
Yeah, there is a swing functionality, but it's kind of a hack, really. I'm not sure if you can see this column here. I've got in the second effect.
That's the time comment.
Yes, that's right. I've got a tempo effect. So what I'm basically doing is, if you think of tempo 120, so that means I've got this step is at 120 BPM, the next step is at 124, then 128, then 124, and then back to 120. So if you think of if you were kind of sitting there and playing with the tempo live, that's basically,
it's like micro tempo, right?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. So you can really play with that quite a bit. You know, you could have 120 at one step, 130 at the next step, and then back to 120. Or you can really customize it quite a bit. I do know that in the next firmware they are including there's a swing effect, which lets you go from. Yeah. So I think that's going to make a lot of people happy, but it's very functional as is if you know that you can play with the tempo on a per step basis, and you just play with that and see how it sounds.
Yeah, well, it's good. I mean, I suppose this is the other thing, because there's so much firmware capabilities. I mean, I don't know what version we're on at the moment, but it's an ongoing project in that sense. But it still works fine. I mean, there's nothing kind of that I'm finding apart from the swing, which I'm very glad to hear about, that is limiting me, you know, outside of just the general limitations of the machine itself.
Yeah, I agree. It's very actively being worked on, which is exciting for many people because they're including a lot of customer feedback. One of the things I've just found about yesterday is this the horizontal view. I think a lot of people might find the tracker paradigm a bit intimidating at first, is because everything's kind of vertical. It goes up and down, and if you're used to drum machines or something, everything goes horizontal. So they are working on a mode where everything is horizontal.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, so if I can just play
Interesting.
this pattern back, and you can see it goes horizontally.
Right, that made more sense for some people for sure. It's the sort of thing that you would need to decide which way you wanted to do, because you don't want to switch once you've kind of got your head around it. I guess that might be a little all of those muscle memory commands.
It's interesting. I agree with that. But as soon as I saw this, I thought of Roland boxes, like a TR-808.
Yeah.
And each of these steps almost looks like one of those buttons. So although I've been used to the vertical view, I also found this to be kind of very familiar, because
Yeah.
you just have to kind of switch your head around to going left to right, and I think it'd be quite approachable for a lot more people maybe. So I think going back to the constant firmware updates is very cool, that they can kind of build in some of these customer requests and feedback, and keep updating it and making it even better. Yeah.
One thing that I've also recently discovered with this sort of light bulb moment is how performative it is. I mean, even though it feels like quite data entry heavy, even though that sounds like a criticism, it's actually very fluent once you get your head around it. But there's a lot of performative stuff in there as well. I mean, the one thing that I found, for instance, is like switching patterns in real time, outside of song mode, to be able to, because if you're coming along and you're in on beat 2, by the time you can switch to the next pattern using the pads. I think I had it set up here. I had it set up here where I was just literally so I'm playing. And I'm able to, and that kind of got my head kind of going, oh, that's really interesting, because that means you can skip around very, very quickly, and those patterns can be jumping about all over the place. But then you've also got that performance mode, which again, I really like this. This is very powerful. Tell me a little bit about that.
Oh, it's a game changer. I love it. I remember playing shows with Reflex touring in Europe or wherever, and I would be playing with my laptop at a time when most people were playing with drum machines and synths and records and things, and it was incredibly limiting. The only thing you could really do is go forward a pattern or backward a pattern, or change the tempo. But they've got this performance mode here where you can basically change tuning, filter, LFO speed, steps, cutoff, delay, reverb. There's so much that you can do. It's kind of mind-blowing, really, that they've got a tracker that you can make the music, and then you can also perform it back, and all within this kind of confined interface. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I find really interesting about it, is the way that you can just, when you're in, you can change the parameter that you're adjusting, and then essentially you've got these buttons here will sort of kick in a parameter that you might record or set up. There we go. I've got it forward. I'm trying to think. I did actually have some parameters set up in this one, but let's go to the next one. So in this one, panning speed or tuning, +3 semitones, +5, and then you assign it to whatever tracks you want those to affect. And that in itself I just found really, really powerful. And I'm guessing I'm probably using it in a very limited basis. Have you got anything set up? I mean, you must be getting quite slick at this. Have you got a pattern where you can use that to show us a little bit how much you can modify what's going on?
Yeah, so you can basically, so I'm loaded up on pattern 11, and all of my tracks here are set to 11. And just on the fly, I can change. Just play back.
So you sort of batch changing those. I notice also what's going on there is you're playing, because I could only figure out how to do this on an individual pattern, but it's actually playing through the song there. And can you juxtapose parts of patterns on top of each other? So if you've got like a drum groove that you're really happy with, you can keep that fixed and then move the song up and down around that, but hold those. I mean, that's something you were mentioning before we came on air, and I was just like, wow, that I didn't even know that. That's another very useful feature.
Right.
I think that's the thing that I find really interesting about that. And so how does it work? I mean, because we've got MIDI in and out, and it will drive external MIDI gear, but obviously the tracks are kind of geared around being monophonic. I mean, how does that work with external equipment? If you wanted to trigger maybe chords on a single track, I think there was in a recent OS, or certainly late last year, there was the ability to do that, right?
To be honest with you, I haven't done much with controlling external gear, but I do know that there's quite a bit of work done on the MIDI functionality. Just this latest firmware, there's been updates to the MIDI capabilities, and I know they're constantly working on that. But yeah, you can control. Let me just switch back to the standard view. So on the instrument, you can change. You can change through the different MIDI outs.
Okay. A MIDI channels.
There you go. Yeah, that's right. So, you can be doing both. You can be playing back your samples, and you can be controlling external gear.
And is that on a per step? So you could have maybe, so if you were being really smart about it, you could have beat 1 triggering like a looped sample that's inside the unit, and then 2, 3, and 4 could be triggering external MIDI events on the same track. Am I getting my head around that? That sounds a bit mind blowing.
I believe so. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think it's quite flexible.
Wow. Okay. Cool. Bogdan, thank you so much for taking us through the tracker. I guess now we just need to let you play out a little bit more of your stuff, and we can hear what you've been doing.